The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Tsunami Martial Arts Academy as Harold Watanabe pushed open the heavy glass door. The familiar smell of sweat and rubber mats filled his nostrils, bringing back memories he had kept buried for years. At 64, Harold moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to be mindful of aging joints. Though his posture remained remarkably straight, the dojo buzzed with activity as evening classes prepared to begin. Young men and women in pristine white GIs stretched and practiced basic forms, their black belts tied with the confidence that came from years of dedicated training. Harold stood in the doorway for a moment, observing the controlled chaos before him. His weathered hands clutched a small gym bag, and his plain clothes made him stand out among the uniformed students. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old third-degree black belt who served as one of the senior instructors. His tone carried the polite but slightly impatient quality of someone accustomed to dealing with curious onlookers who wandered in off the street. Harold smiled gently. "I was hoping to inquire about joining your classes. I know I'm probably older than your typical student, but I've always been interested in martial arts." Marcus looked Harold up and down, taking in the gray hair, the slight stoop of his shoulders, and the way he seemed to favor his left leg slightly when he walked. Behind Marcus, several other black belts had noticed the exchange and were beginning to gather, their conversations dying down as they focused on the unusual visitor. "Well, sir," Marcus began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone delivering bad news gently. "Our classes can be pretty intensive. We focus on traditional Shotokan karate, with full contact sparring. Most of our students start when they're much younger, and the physical demands can be quite challenging." A few snickers erupted from the group of black belts behind Marcus. David Rodriguez, a stocky second-degree black belt known for his aggressive fighting style, stepped forward with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No offense, old man," David said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the other students to hear, "but this isn't exactly a senior center Tai Chi class. We hit hard here and we hit fast. Someone your age could get seriously hurt." Harold's expression remained unchanged, though something flickered briefly in his dark eyes. "I understand your concern," he replied calmly. "Perhaps I could observe a class first? I promise to stay out of the way." Sarah Mitchell, a fierce competitor who held her second-degree black belt and had won several regional tournaments, crossed her arms and exchanged glances with her fellow black belts. "I don't know if that's such a good idea," she said, her voice dripping with barely concealed condescension. "Watching us might give you the wrong impression about what we do here. This isn't some Hollywood movie where everyone flies through the air. Real karate is brutal, technical, and unforgiving." The group of black belts had grown larger now, drawn by the entertainment of watching their instructors deal with what they clearly viewed as a delusional senior citizen. Whispered comments and poorly suppressed laughter rippled through the gathering crowd. "Maybe he thinks he's the next karate kid," someone muttered from the back, prompting another round of chuckles. Harold stood patiently through the mockery, his hand still clutching his gym bag. His breathing remained steady, and his posture hadn't changed despite the increasingly hostile reception. When the laughter died down, he spoke again, his voice soft but carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "I understand this is unusual," he said, looking directly at Marcus, "but I'm willing to sign any waiver you require, and I'm prepared to pay for lessons in advance. I'm not asking for special treatment or modified training. I simply want to learn." Marcus found himself in an awkward position. The dojo's owner, Sensei Williams, was traveling for a tournament and had left Marcus in charge for the week. The academy prided itself on being open to serious students of all backgrounds, but the liability issues alone made accepting a student Harold's age problematic. Still, there was something about the old man's quiet persistence that gave Marcus pause. "Look, Mr. Marcus began, realizing he didn't even know the man's name. "Watanabe," Harold supplied. "Harold Watanabe. Mr. Watanabe, I appreciate your interest, I really do. But our insurance policies, the physical demands, the risk of injury, it's just not practical. There are other schools that might be better suited to someone with your, experience level." David stepped closer, his chest puffed out with the confidence of youth and training. "What my friend Marcus is trying to say politely is that you'd be wasting everyone's time, including your own. This isn't a game, old man. We've spent years earning these belts, sweating blood on these mats. You can't just walk in here at 60 whatever and expect to keep up with real martial artists. The dismissive laughter that followed David's words was louder this time, and Harold could see that even some of the newer students had stopped their training to watch the spectacle. He noticed how the black belts stood with unconscious arrogance, their stances betraying years of training but also a comfortable assumption of superiority. Harold nodded slowly as if accepting their assessment.
"I see," he said quietly.
Well, I suppose I should have expected this reaction. Thank you for your time. He turned to leave, and for a moment it seemed like the encounter would end there. But as he reached the door, Harold paused and looked back over his shoulder. Just out of curiosity, he said, his voice still carrying that same gentle tone. How long would you say it takes to earn a black belt here? Marcus straightened up, happy to be on more comfortable ground discussing the dojo standards. We maintain very high standards. Most students train for 4 to 5 years before testing for first-degree black belt. It's not something we take lightly. Harold smiled again, and for just a moment, there was something different about his expression, a flicker of something that might have been amusement or perhaps something deeper. 4 to 5 years, he repeated softly. That's very impressive. You should be proud of your dedication. Without another word, Harold pushed open the door and walked out into the evening air, leaving behind a group of black belts who were already moving on to other conversations. The strange old man quickly forgotten in the rush to begin their training session. None of them noticed that Harold didn't walk to a car in the parking lot. Instead, he sat down on a bench across the street, opened his gym bag, and pulled out a worn paperback book. As the dojo's lights blazed in the gathering darkness, Harold Watanabe settled in to read, occasionally glancing up at the building with an expression that suggested this conversation was far from over. 3 days later, Harold Watanabe appeared at the dojo again. This time he wore a simple white guy that looked like it had seen years of use, though it was clean and properly pressed. The fabric was soft with age, and the sleeves and pants legs had been hemmed to fit his modest frame perfectly. Most notably, he wore no belt at all, just the white cord that held his GI jacket closed. Marcus was teaching the advanced evening class when Harold entered. The same group of black belts from earlier in the week were present, along with several brown belts and a handful of dedicated students working toward their next rank. The energy in the room was high as they prepared for what Marcus had promised would be an intensive sparring session. You've got to be kidding me, David muttered when he spotted Harold standing quietly by the entrance. Someone needs to call security. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. This is getting ridiculous. The old guy clearly doesn't understand plain English. Harold approached Marcus, who was demonstrating a complex combination sequence to a group of brown belts. When Marcus finished the technique, Harold cleared his throat softly. Excuse me, Harold said politely. I spoke with Sensei Williams yesterday. He said I could join tonight's class on a trial basis. Marcus frowned, clearly caught off guard. Sensei Williams had returned from his tournament the night before, but Marcus hadn't had a chance to speak with him about the strange encounter from earlier in the week. The older instructor sometimes made impulsive decisions that left his assistant instructors scrambling to adapt. Sensei Williams said that? Marcus asked, unable to hide his surprise. Harold reached into his GI and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He asked me to give you this. Marcus unfolded the note and read it quickly. His expression shifted from confusion to resignation. Sensei Williams had indeed authorized Harold's participation, with a brief note explaining that all proper waivers had been signed and that Marcus should treat Mr. Watanabe like any other new student. Well, Marcus said finally, tucking the note into his pocket, I guess we're doing this. Everyone, we have a new student joining us tonight. This is Mr. Watanabe. The announcement was met with a mixture of barely concealed snickers and outright stares. David stepped forward, his muscular frame towering over Harold's smaller stature. Just so we're clear, old man, David said loudly enough for everyone to hear. We don't slow down for anybody. If you can't keep up, that's on you. Harold bowed slightly. I understand. Thank you for allowing me to train with you. Marcus decided to start Harold with basic conditioning exercises, hoping the older man would quickly realize he was in over his head and leave voluntarily. We'll begin with our standard warm-up, he announced to the class. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, and 5 minutes of shadow boxing. The black belts dropped to the floor and began their push-ups with practiced efficiency. Harold lowered himself more slowly, and Marcus expected to see the modified knee push-ups that most beginners his age would require. Instead, Harold assumed a perfect push-up position and began moving through the exercise with controlled, steady movements. What struck Marcus first was Harold's form. Each push-up was executed with textbook precision, his back perfectly straight, his breathing controlled, his movements smooth and deliberate. While the younger students powered through their repetitions with youthful energy, Harold maintained a rhythm that was slower but somehow more purposeful. "Not bad for an old guy," Sarah commented, though her tone suggested she was grudgingly impressed despite herself. Harold completed all 50 push-ups without showing signs of strain. His breathing was elevated but controlled, and when he moved to sit-ups, the same pattern emerged. His technique was flawless, his pace steady, and his endurance surprisingly solid. The shadow boxing portion proved even more interesting. While the other students threw rapid combinations with explosive power, Harold moved through his forms with fluid precision. His punches and kicks flowed seamlessly into one another, and his footwork displayed a level of balance and coordination that made several of the brown belts pause in their own exercises to watch. "Where did you say you trained before?" Marcus asked as the warm-up concluded. "I didn't say," Harold replied simply, toweling sweat from his forehead. "Should I continue with the class?" Marcus found himself nodding despite his reservations. "We're moving to basic technique drills. Partner up for bag work." The black belts paired off quickly, leaving Harold standing alone until Marcus assigned him to work with Jennifer Walsh, a brown belt who had been training for 3 years. Jennifer approached the arrangement with the resigned patience of someone who expected to spend the next 30 minutes teaching basic punches to someone who would probably injure himself trying to hit the heavy bag. "Have you done any bag work before?" Jennifer asked as they approached one of the heavy bags suspended from the ceiling. "A little," Harold replied. "Please show me what you'd like me to do." Jennifer demonstrated the combination Marcus had called out, a basic sequence of jab, cross, hook, and front kick. Her technique was solid, though she telegraphed her punches slightly and her stance was a bit wide for optimal power generation. Harold watched carefully, nodding as she explained the finer points. "Now you try," Jennifer said, stepping back to give Harold room. Harold approached the bag and assumed his stance. Something in his posture immediately caught Jennifer's attention. The way he distributed his weight, the subtle positioning of his hands, the alertness in his eyes. When he threw his first jab, the bag jumped with surprising force. The punch wasn't flashy or explosive like David's thunderous strikes, but it carried a focused energy that seemed to transfer efficiently from Harold's body through his fist and into the target. His cross followed with the same controlled power, and his hook whipped around with a snap that made the heavy bag sway noticeably. His front kick was perhaps the most impressive technique. While many students Harold's age would struggle with balance and flexibility, he lifted his knee smoothly, extended his leg with perfect form, and drove his foot into the bag with enough force to make the entire apparatus shudder. "That was really good," Jennifer said, and her surprise was genuine. "Your form is excellent. Have you been practicing this combination at home?" Harold shook his head. "I just tried to follow your example. You're a very good teacher." As the class progressed through various drills, a pattern began to emerge. Harold wasn't the fastest or strongest student in the room, but his technique was consistently precise. When Marcus demonstrated complex defensive movements, Harold seemed to absorb the instruction immediately. His blocks were efficient, his counterattacks well-timed, and his footwork displayed an understanding of distance and timing that typically took years to develop. The black belts began to notice. Conversations that had started with mocking comments about the old man gradually shifted to puzzled observations about his surprising competence. "He's probably been taking classes somewhere else," David theorized during a water break. "Maybe he's been doing some McDojo strip mall karate for a few months and thinks he's ready for the real thing." Sarah watched Harold practice a kata sequence that Marcus had shown the class. If he learned that somewhere else whoever taught him knows what they're doing. Look at his hip rotation on that reverse punch. By the end of the class, Harold had not only kept up with every drill, but had done so with a level of technical proficiency that left several students questioning their initial assumptions. When Marcus called for final bows, Harold's movements carried the same precise formality that marked a student who understood the deeper traditions of martial arts. As students began changing out of their GIs, David approached Harold with a combination of curiosity and challenge in his expression. "Not bad for your first night," David said, his tone still carrying an edge of condescension. But bag work and basic drills are one thing. Real karate happens when you're facing an opponent who's trying to hit you back. Maybe next week you'll be ready to try some light sparring. Harold finished folding his GI and looked up at David with that same gentle smile he'd worn throughout the evening. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "Thank you for the encouragement." As Harold left the dojo that night, the group of black belts stood together discussing the unexpected turn of events. None of them were quite sure what to make of their newest classmate, but all of them agreed on one thing. Next week's sparring session was going to be very interesting indeed. The following Tuesday brought an unusual energy to the dojo. Word had spread among the regular students about the mysterious older man who had surprised everyone with his technical skills, and attendance was noticeably higher than usual. Even some students who typically skipped the Tuesday evening classes had found reasons to be present. Harold arrived early, already changed into his worn white gi. He sat quietly in Caesar position at the edge of the training area, eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. His breathing was slow and controlled, and there was a stillness about him that seemed almost out of place in the busy pre-class atmosphere. Marcus had spent considerable time over the weekend thinking about Harold's first session. The man's technique had been undeniably impressive, but technique without the ability to apply it under pressure was merely academic exercise. Tonight's sparring session would reveal whether Harold's skills translated to actual martial ability, or if he was simply good at mimicking movements he'd seen. "All right, everyone," Marcus called as the class gathered. "Tonight we're focusing on controlled sparring, light to medium contact, and I want to see clean technique over power. We'll rotate partners every 3 minutes." David cracked his knuckles loudly, his eyes fixed on Harold. "I volunteer to go first with the new guy. Someone needs to show him what real karate looks like." Several of the black belts exchanged knowing glances. David's sparring style was notoriously aggressive, even when instructed to keep things light. More than one newer student had left the dojo after an encounter with David's version of controlled contact. Harold stood and bowed to David, his movements fluid and respectful. As they faced each other in the center of the mat, the contrast between them was striking. David stood 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and thick arms of someone who spent considerable time in the weight room. His stance was aggressive and forward-leaning, designed to intimidate as much as to fight. Harold, by comparison, looked almost fragile, his smaller frame and graying hair making him appear vulnerable. "Ready, old man?" David asked with a predatory grin. "Try not to break a hip." Marcus raised his hand. "Fighters ready, begin." David immediately pressed forward with a combination that would have overwhelmed most opponents. His jab shot out with lightning speed, followed by a crushing cross aimed at Harold's head. But Harold was no longer where the punches were directed. He had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, allowing David's strikes to pass harmlessly by while simultaneously closing the distance between them. What happened next occurred so quickly that several students missed it entirely. Harold's left hand rose in what appeared to be a simple block, but instead of stopping David's incoming right cross, it redirected the punch while Harold's right hand delivered a precise palm strike to David's solar plexus. The technique wasn't particularly hard, but it was perfectly placed and timed. David's forward momentum carried him directly into Harold's counterattack, and the larger man found himself suddenly breathless and off balance. "Point to Harold," Marcus called, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Reset." David's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. No one had scored on him that quickly in months, and certainly not some senior citizen in his first sparring session. He reset his stance with visible tension, his previous swagger replaced by focused aggression. The second exchange lasted longer but ended with an even more impressive display from Harold. David launched a series of kicks designed to test Harold's mobility and defensive skills. A front kick aimed at the midsection, followed by a roundhouse kick to the ribs, then a higher kick targeting Harold's head. Harold moved through David's attack like water flowing around stones. He didn't block in the conventional sense, instead using minimal movements to redirect each kick, while maintaining perfect balance and positioning. As David's final kick extended toward his head, Harold ducked slightly and swept David's supporting leg with a perfectly timed foot sweep that sent the younger man tumbling to the mat. The dojo fell silent except for the sound of David hitting the floor. Harold immediately stepped back and offered his hand to help David up, his expression showing no trace of triumph or mockery. "Your kicks have excellent power. Harold said quietly as David regained his feet. But perhaps you're telegraphing them slightly with your hip movement. David stared at Harold for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had been completely outclassed by someone he'd dismissed as a joke just minutes earlier. Time, Marcus called, though he was as stunned as everyone else in the room. Rotate partners. Harold's next opponent was Sarah, who approached the match with considerably more caution than David had shown. She had watched Harold's previous performance with growing respect and had no intention of underestimating him. Sarah was known for her speed and precision rather than raw power. Her fighting style relied on quick combinations and excellent timing, and she had defeated several male opponents who outweighed her significantly. She began the match with probing attacks, testing Harold's reactions and looking for openings. What she discovered was frustrating and fascinating in equal measure. Harold seemed to anticipate her attacks before she fully committed to them. His defensive movements were minimal but perfectly efficient, and his counterattacks came from unexpected angles with surprising accuracy. When Sarah threw a lightning-fast jab-cross combination, Harold slipped both punches and responded with a gentle but precise strike to her shoulder that would have been devastating if delivered with full power. When she attempted a spinning heel kick, he simply wasn't there when her foot arrived. Having moved just enough to avoid the technique while positioning himself for a counter that he chose not to complete. He's playing with us, Sarah realized with growing amazement. Throughout their entire 3-minute session, Harold had multiple opportunities to score decisive points, but he consistently pulled his techniques at the last moment, delivering just enough contact to demonstrate that he could have hit her without actually causing harm. As the evening progressed, Harold sparred with each of the black belts in turn. The pattern remained consistent. He defended effortlessly against their attacks and countered with techniques that showcased a level of skill that none of them had expected. What was perhaps most unsettling was how relaxed he remained throughout each match. While his opponents became increasingly winded and frustrated, Harold's breathing never changed, and his movements maintained the same fluid efficiency from beginning to end. When Harold faced Jennifer, the brown belt who had partnered with him during bag work, the difference in their skill levels became even more apparent. Jennifer was talented and dedicated, but Harold moved through her attacks with an ease that suggested he was operating on an entirely different level. He seemed to know what she was going to do before she did it, and his counters came with a precision that spoke of decades of experience. "Where did you train before coming here?" Jennifer asked breathlessly after their session ended. Harold smiled and bowed respectfully. "Here and there," he said simply. "You have excellent form. Your sensei has taught you well." As the class wound down, Marcus found himself facing a dilemma he had never encountered before. Harold had just outperformed every advanced student in the dojo, including black belts with years of experience, and he had done it while wearing no belt at all. The man's skill level was clearly far beyond what any beginner should possess, yet he had shown up claiming to be interested in learning. The black belts gathered around Marcus after Harold left, their voices filled with confused excitement. "That was impossible," David said, his pride still stinging from his earlier defeat. "There's no way someone that old moves like that unless he's been training for years. Decades even." Sarah nodded in agreement. "His timing was perfect. Not good, not impressive, perfect. You don't develop that kind of precision overnight." "And did you see his breathing?" added Jennifer. "He never got tired. Not even close. The rest of us were exhausted after 3 minutes, and he looked like he could have gone all night." Marcus had noticed all of these things and more. Harold's footwork suggested training in multiple martial arts styles. His defensive movements incorporated elements of traditional karate, but also showed influences from Aikido and possibly jiu-jitsu. His counterattacks demonstrated a fighting intelligence that could only come from extensive experience. "He's been lying to us from the beginning," Marcus concluded. "The question is why? What's a martial artist of his caliber doing pretending to be a beginner at our dojo?" The answer to that question would have to wait until next week. But one thing was certain. Their mysterious new student had secrets that ran much deeper than any of them had imagined. As they locked up the dojo that night, each of the black belts was already planning how they would approach their next encounter with Harold Watanabe, the 64-year-old man who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. By Thursday evening, the atmosphere at Tsunami Martial Arts Academy had changed dramatically. Word of Harold's performance during Tuesday's sparring session had spread beyond the regular students, and the dojo was packed with curious observers. Black belts from other local schools had found excuses to visit, and even some of the instructors from nearby dojos had quietly slipped in to watch. Sensei Williams himself was present for the first time since Harold had begun training. The 55-year-old dojo owner was a 7th-degree black belt with over 40 years of martial arts experience, and he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from decades of serious training. He had been intrigued by Marcus's reports about their unusual new student and wanted to observe Harold firsthand. Harold arrived at his usual time, moving through his pre-class meditation with the same serene focus he had displayed since his first visit. But tonight there was a different energy around him, a subtle tension that suggested he was aware of the increased attention and prepared for whatever might come. David approached Harold before class began, his expression serious and determined. The embarrassment of Tuesday's sparring session had been eating at him for 2 days, and he had spent hours analyzing what had gone wrong. "I've been thinking about our match," David said without preamble. "You held back a lot. I want to know why." Harold looked up from his meditation position, his dark eyes meeting David's with calm directness. "I sparred according to the rules your instructor established. Light to medium contact." "Don't give me that," David replied, his voice rising slightly. "You could have knocked me out 3 different times in that first exchange alone. You're not some beginner, and we both know it. So what's your game?" The conversation was drawing attention from other students, and Marcus quickly stepped over to intervene before the situation escalated further. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, though his own curiosity about Harold's background was evident in his voice. Sarah joined the group, followed by several other black belts. "We all want answers," she said bluntly. "Your skill level is way beyond anything we've seen from someone claiming to be a beginner. You've been deceiving us since day one." Harold stood slowly, his movements carrying the same controlled grace that marked all his actions. When he reached his full height, his posture seemed somehow different, straighter, more alert, with an undercurrent of contained power that hadn't been visible before. "I have never claimed to be a beginner," Harold said quietly. "I asked to join your classes to learn." "Those are not the same thing." "Learn what?" David demanded. "You already know more than most of us. What could we possibly teach someone with your experience?" For a long moment, Harold remained silent, studying the faces of the students gathered around him. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean in to listen. Every school has its own personality, its own interpretation of the arts. I wanted to understand yours, to see how the traditional techniques are being taught to the next generation, to learn from your perspective. Sensei Williams, who had been observing the exchange from across the room, approached the group. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the circle of students parted respectfully to allow him through. "Mr. Watanabe," Sensei Williams said formally, "perhaps it's time for a more honest conversation. Your skill level suggests extensive training over many years, yet you've provided no background about your martial arts history. My students deserve to know who they're training with." Harold turned to face Sensei Williams, and for the first time since he'd entered the dojo, his demeanor shifted noticeably. His casual, almost deferential manner was replaced by something more formal, more intense. When he bowed to Sensei Williams, it was with the deep respect of one serious martial artist acknowledging another. "You are correct, Sensei," Harold said. "I have been less than complete in my introduction. I have trained for most of my life in various disciplines. I came here not as a beginner, but as someone seeking to continue learning. The deception was not intended to insult your school or your students." David stepped forward aggressively. "That's not good enough. You made fools of us. You let us mock you. Let us think we were dealing with some delusional old man, and then you embarrassed us in front of everyone." The anger in David's voice was attracting attention from across the dojo, and other students were beginning to gather. Harold's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes suggested that David was pushing toward a line that shouldn't be crossed. "I never made fools of anyone," Harold replied softly. "You did that yourselves with your assumptions." The words hit David like a physical blow. His face flushed red with anger and humiliation, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You want to see assumptions?" David snarled. "Let's settle this properly. Real sparring, full contact. No more games, no more holding back. Let's find out what you're really made of, old man. A murmur rippled through the gathered students. Full contact sparring was serious business. Typically reserved for advanced students preparing for competition or rank testing, it required protective gear and careful supervision, and injuries were not uncommon. Sensei Williams started to intervene, but Harold raised a hand gently to stop him. "Are you certain that's what you want?" Harold asked David, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. "Full contact can be very different from controlled sparring." "I'm sure," David replied without hesitation. "Unless you're scared to face someone who won't just stand there and let you show off." Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering the challenge. Around them, the dojo had fallen silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant traffic outside. Even the newest students could sense that something significant was happening. "Very well," Harold said finally, "but I want everyone to understand if we do this, we do it properly. Traditional rules, proper respect, and we accept whatever outcome results." Marcus looked between the two men with growing concern. "Maybe we should think about this. David, you're angry, and that's not a good mindset for serious sparring. And Mr. Watanabe, with respect, full contact at your age." Harold smiled, and for the first time since entering the dojo, his smile carried something other than gentle politeness. There was confidence there, and perhaps something that might have been anticipation. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus, but I believe David needs to learn something that can only be taught through direct experience." Sensei Williams stepped forward, his authority asserting itself over the situation. "If we're going to do this, we do it by the book. Protective gear, proper officiating, and clear rules. This isn't a street fight." As the students scattered to retrieve protective equipment and set up the formal sparring area, Harold walked to his bag and began pulling out gear of his own. The equipment was well maintained but clearly aged, bearing the marks of extensive use. His sparring gloves were custom fitted. His chest protector was reinforced in ways that suggested serious competition experience, and his headgear bore small patches that several of the more experienced students recognized as tournament identifications. David suited up with the aggressive enthusiasm of someone who believed he was about to prove a point. His gear was newer and flashier, and he moved through his warm-up routine with explosive power designed to intimidate his opponent. Harold's preparation was completely different. He moved through a series of stretches and breathing exercises that seemed to center and focus his energy rather than pump him up. His movements were deliberate and purposeful, and by the time he finished, he seemed to have transformed into someone completely different from the mild-mannered man who had first walked into their dojo. As they faced each other in the center of the mat, with Sensei Williams serving as referee and the entire dojo gathered in a circle around them, David began to understand that he might have made a serious mistake. Harold's stance was perfect, his breathing controlled, and his eyes held the focused intensity of someone who had faced real danger many times before. "Fighters ready?" Sensei Williams called. Both men bowed and assumed their fighting positions. "Begin." What happened next would be discussed in martial arts circles for years to come. But in that moment, all David knew was that he had challenged someone far beyond his ability to handle, and there was no backing down. The match began with David's signature opening, an explosive forward rush designed to overwhelm his opponent before they could establish their rhythm. His left jab snapped out with the speed and power that had intimidated dozens of sparring partners over the years, followed immediately by a devastating right cross, aimed at Harold's head. But Harold was simply not there. The older man had shifted his weight so subtly that David's punches cut through empty air, while Harold simultaneously moved inside David's guard. What happened next defied everything the watching students thought they understood about combat timing and distance. Harold's response came in 3 parts, executed so smoothly they seemed like a single motion. His left hand redirected David's right cross with a deflection that used David's own momentum against him. His right hand delivered a precise strike to David's solar plexus that folded the younger man forward, and his left leg swept David's supporting foot out from under him, sending the stocky fighter crashing to the mat. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. David hit the floor hard, his protective gear clattering against the mat. For a moment, he lay there gasping for breath, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The spectating students stood in stunned silence, many of them having missed the details of Harold's technique entirely. "Point to Harold," Sensei Williams called, his voice carrying a note of professional admiration. "Reset." David struggled to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and mounting rage. No one had ever dismantled him so completely, and certainly not someone old enough to be his grandfather. He reset his stance, but this time there was a desperate edge to his aggression. "Lucky shot," David muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Harold said nothing. His expression remained calm and focused, but there was something different about his posture now. The mild-mannered demeanor had completely disappeared, replaced by the bearing of someone who had stood in this position countless times before. David's second attack was more cautious but equally unsuccessful. He threw a testing jab, then attempted a roundhouse kick to Harold's ribs. Harold slipped the punch with minimal movement and caught David's kicking leg with both hands. Before David could react, Harold had swept his supporting leg and gently guided the larger man to the ground once again. This time, David didn't get up immediately. He lay on the mat staring at the ceiling, his breathing heavy and his confidence completely shattered. "I think that's enough," Sensei Williams began, but David cut him off. "No," David said, climbing to his feet with obvious effort. "I'm not done. One more round." Harold tilted his head slightly, studying David with what might have been compassion. "Are you certain? There's no shame in stopping here." "I said I'm not done," David snapped, his voice echoing through the silent dojo. The third and final exchange lasted exactly 7 seconds. David launched himself forward with everything he had, throwing a wild combination of punches and kicks with no regard for defense or technique. Harold moved through the chaotic attack like a dancer, deflecting what needed to be deflected and avoiding everything else. When David overextended himself with a desperate haymaker punch, Harold finally responded with something approaching his full capability. His counterattack was a perfect example of classical karate technique, a rising block that redirected David's punch upward, followed by a reverse punch that stopped precisely 1 inch from David's solar plexus. The demonstration of control was absolute. Harold could have driven that punch through David's protective gear and inflicted serious damage, but instead he held it in perfect position, his knuckles barely touching the chest protector. "Yame," Sensei Williams called, ending the match. "Winner, Harold." David staggered backward, his legs shaky and his breathing ragged. The reality of how completely he had been outclassed was written across his face in stark detail. Harold immediately stepped forward and offered his hand, helping David remove his protective gear with the same gentle courtesy he had shown since his first day at the dojo. "You fight with great spirit," Harold said quietly. "With proper guidance, that passion could serve you well." As David sat on the sidelines struggling to process his defeat, the other students gathered around Harold with expressions ranging from awe to confusion to fear. Sarah was the first to speak. "Who are you?" she asked bluntly. "And don't give us any more vague answers about training here and there. Nobody learns to fight like that as a hobby." Harold removed his protective gear methodically, his movements suggesting a lifetime of following proper dojo protocol. When he finished, he looked around at the faces of the students who had spent the past weeks dismissing him as a delusional old man. "My name is Harold Watanabe," he began formally. "I began training in traditional Okinawan karate when I was 7 years old under my grandfather, who had studied directly under several of the original masters. I earned my first-degree black belt when I was 15. The students exchanged glances. A first-degree black belt at 15 was impressive, but not unheard of. What Harold said next, however, left them speechless. "I am currently ranked as a 10th degree black belt in Shotokan karate, 9th degree in Goju Ryu, and 8th degree in Kyokushin. I have also studied Aikido, Judo, and several forms of Chinese martial arts over the past 57 years of training." The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. 10th degree black belt was a rank so high that most students had never met anyone who held it. It typically required decades of training, teaching, and contribution to the martial arts community. There were perhaps a few dozen people in the entire United States who legitimately held such rank. Marcus found his voice first. 57 years? You started training when you were 7? Harold nodded. My family immigrated to the United States from Okinawa when I was very young. My grandfather insisted that I learn our traditional fighting arts as a way of staying connected to our heritage. I've been training ever since. Jennifer raised her hand tentatively as if she were in school. Are you a teacher yourself? For the first time since revealing his background, Harold smiled with something approaching warmth. I was for many years. I ran my own dojo in San Francisco for 35 years before retiring. I taught several students who went on to open their own schools, and a few who competed at the national level. Sarah's eyes widened with sudden recognition. Wait, Watanabe, San Francisco? Were you Harold Watanabe of the Golden Gate Dojo? Harold's expression confirmed her guess. Several of the older black belts gasped in recognition. The Golden Gate Dojo had been legendary in martial arts circles, a traditional school that had produced some of the most respected martial artists on the West Coast. Its founder had been known for his incredible technique and his demanding training methods. I closed the dojo when my wife became ill, Harold continued quietly. After she passed away last year, I decided to travel and visit other schools. I wanted to see how the arts are being taught by the next generation, and perhaps learn something new myself. Sensei Williams stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Master Watanabe, I owe you an apology. If I had known who you were, Harold raised a hand to stop him. Please, just Harold. And there is no need for apologies. I chose not to reveal my background because I wanted to observe your school as it truly is, not as it might become if you were trying to impress a visiting master. The implications of Harold's presence were beginning to sink in. For the past weeks, they had been training in front of one of the most accomplished martial artists in the country. Every technique they had demonstrated, every mistake they had made, every moment of arrogance or disrespect had been witnessed by someone whose knowledge and experience dwarfed their own. David finally spoke from where he sat on the sidelines, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you let us mock you? Why didn't you just tell us who you were from the beginning? Harold walked over and sat down beside David, his manner as gentle as it had been since his first day at the dojo. Because your initial reaction taught me something important about your character, and because sometimes the most valuable lessons can only be learned through direct experience. The old master looked around at the assembled students, his gaze taking in each face with the practiced assessment of someone who had taught hundreds of students over the decades. You are all skilled martial artists, he said finally. But skill without humility becomes arrogance. Power without respect becomes bullying. You had forgotten that every person who walks through your door deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their age, size, or apparent ability. The truth of his words settled over the dojo like a weight. In the space of 30 minutes, Harold Watanabe had not only demonstrated his incredible martial arts abilities, but had also delivered a lesson in character that none of them would ever forget. In the weeks that followed Harold's revelation, the atmosphere at Tsunami Martial Arts Academy underwent a profound transformation. The changes were subtle at first, students bowing more deeply to one another, conversations that focused on technique rather than who could hit hardest, and a new level of respect shown to every person who entered the dojo. Harold continued attending classes twice a week, but his role had evolved significantly. Sensei Williams had formally invited him to serve as a guest instructor, and Harold had accepted with the understanding that he would focus on traditional applications and the deeper philosophical aspects of martial arts training. David's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The humbling experience of being so thoroughly outclassed had initially left him withdrawn and questioning everything he thought he knew about martial arts. But Harold's patient guidance helped him channel his natural aggression into more productive directions. Strength without control is just violence, Harold explained during a private session where he worked with David on breathing techniques and mental focus. Your physical gifts are considerable, but they will only take you so far. True martial arts mastery comes from understanding when not to use your power. Under Harold's tutelage, David began to develop a fighting style that was still aggressive, but now contained a level of precision and restraint that made him far more effective. More importantly, his attitude toward newer students changed completely. The young man who had once mocked a 64-year-old stranger now spent his free time helping beginners learn basic techniques. Sarah found herself drawn to the traditional forms that Harold demonstrated with such masterful precision. Her natural speed and accuracy were enhanced by Harold's teachings about proper breathing, mental focus, and the historical applications of classical movements. Every movement in kata has meaning, Harold explained as he guided her through an advanced form. These are not just exercises for flexibility or memory. Each technique represents a solution to a specific combat problem that our predecessors faced and solved. Marcus discovered that having a true master in the dojo elevated everyone's performance. Harold's presence encouraged students to train with greater intensity and focus, knowing that their efforts were being observed by someone who truly understood the arts at the deepest level. Jennifer, the brown belt who had first partnered with Harold, became one of his most dedicated students. Her natural teaching ability flourished under Harold's guidance, and she began to understand that martial arts instruction was about far more than just demonstrating techniques. Teaching is a responsibility, Harold told her during one of their conversations. When someone trusts you to guide their martial arts journey, you are shaping not just their physical abilities but their character. Every lesson you give reflects your own understanding of what these arts truly represent. The changes extended beyond the advanced students. New members were now greeted with genuine warmth and encouragement, regardless of their age, size, or apparent ability. The story of Harold's first weeks at the dojo had become something of a legend, serving as a constant reminder that assumptions about people were often wrong and always dangerous. One evening, about 2 months after Harold's identity had been revealed, an elderly woman entered the dojo inquiring about classes. She was 72 years old, moved with the careful deliberation of someone recovering from hip surgery, and explained that her doctor had recommended martial arts training to help with balance and flexibility. The reception she received would have been unthinkable during Harold's first visit. David immediately stepped forward to welcome her, his manner respectful and encouraging. Sarah offered to give her a tour of the facility and explain the different programs available. Marcus spent 20 minutes answering her questions with patience and genuine interest. Harold watched these interactions from across the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When the woman left with information about beginner classes and a promise to return the following week, Harold approached the group of black belts. "Now you begin to understand," he said simply. The philosophical aspects of Harold's teaching proved to be as valuable as his technical instruction. He spoke often about the concept of beginner's mind, the idea that even the most advanced practitioners should approach their training with the openness and humility of someone just starting their journey. The moment you believe you have nothing left to learn is the moment you stop growing. Harold explained during one of his informal lectures, "I have been training for 57 years and I still discover new things about these arts regularly. Arrogance is the enemy of progress." These lessons extended far beyond the dojo walls. Students found themselves approaching other areas of their lives with greater humility and openness. David discovered that the same patience Harold had taught him in martial arts improved his relationships with co-workers and family members. Sarah applied Harold's teachings about focus and breathing to her high-stress job as a nurse, finding that she could remain calm and effective even in chaotic situations. As spring turned to summer, Harold announced that he would be continuing his travels, visiting other dojos across the country. The news was met with disappointment from students who had come to value his presence and teaching enormously. "Will you come back?" Jennifer asked during Harold's final regular class. Harold smiled with the same gentle warmth he had shown since his first day at the dojo. "Perhaps, but more importantly, you will carry forward what you have learned here. The true test of these lessons is not whether you can demonstrate them in front of me, but whether you can live them when no one is watching." On Harold's last evening at Tsunami Martial Arts Academy, Sensei Williams organized a formal ceremony to honor their visiting master. The entire dojo community gathered, including students from other local schools who had heard about Harold's teachings. David, speaking on behalf of all the students, delivered a short speech that captured the impact Harold had made on their lives. "When you first walked into our dojo," David said, his voice steady but emotional, "we saw only what we expected to see, an old man who didn't belong in our world. We were so focused on our own prejudices and assumptions that we couldn't recognize wisdom when it stood right in front of us." He paused, looking around at his fellow students. "You taught us the true strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how many techniques you know. It's about how you treat people, especially those who can't do anything for you in return. You showed us that respect isn't something you earn through rank or reputation. It's something you give to every person you meet." Harold listened to David's words with quiet attention, his expression showing both pride and humility. When the speech ended and the applause died down, he stood to address the assembled students one final time. "You have given me a great gift during my time here, Harold said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent dojo. You allowed me to remember why I fell in love with these arts so many years ago. Not because they taught me to fight, but because they taught me to be a better person. He looked around at the faces of students, who had become more than just martial artists. Under his guidance, they had become better human beings. The techniques you learn here will fade if you don't practice them, Harold continued. Your bodies will age, your reflexes will slow, and your physical abilities will diminish. But the character you develop, the respect you show others, and the humility you carry in your hearts, these things will remain with you forever. As Harold bowed to the assembled students for the final time, there wasn't a dry eye in the dojo. The old master, who had entered as a stranger just a few months earlier, was leaving as a beloved teacher, whose lessons would echo through the lives of everyone he had touched. 6 months later, when new students entered Tsunami Martial Arts Academy, they were greeted with warmth, respect, and genuine interest in their martial arts journey. The story of Harold Watanabe had become part of the dojo's culture, a constant reminder that every person deserves dignity and that the greatest masters are often hidden in the most unexpected places. And somewhere across the country, in another dojo, another community of martial artists was about to learn the same valuable lesson from a quiet, elderly man in a worn white gi who asked only for the chance to train alongside them and perhaps learn something new.